He had always been the kind of guy who followed the rules, finished his assignments early, and called home every Sunday. At 24, nearing the final lap of his international development degree, Thomas was chosen for a field project that would take him across Africa for 6 months. For someone born and raised in a quiet white suburb in Minnesota, the idea of exploring Nairobi's energy or Cape Town's contrast was thrilling. But he didn't expect that the most unforgettable part of the trip wouldn't be the safaris or the volunteer work. It would be a girl named Amara, who stopped him in his tracks on a humid Wednesday afternoon in Accra, laughing while handing out flyers for a community health workshop. She looked at him once, then again, and smiled like they had known each other before. He didn't know it yet, but that smile would be the start of everything and the reason everything would later fall apart. They started talking after the workshop. She was 22, studying public health, spoke 3 languages, and had the kind of insight most people his age lacked. There was something about the way Amara saw the world, not as a set of borders but as a fabric of stories. They were supposed to just share notes on their research, but instead they shared cab rides, food stalls, long walks, and eventually each other's secrets. For Thomas, it was the first time he had ever felt a connection that wasn't measured by GPA, career plans, or checkboxes. But in the back of his mind, there was always a voice, his mother's voice, soft but sharp, saying things like, "I just want you to be with someone who understands you culturally." He never challenged it. Not yet. The more time they spent together, the harder it became to imagine going back without her. Amara showed him life outside the bubble he didn't realize he had grown up in. They took trips to Kumasi, hiked in the Volta region, danced at festivals, and got caught in rainstorms that made them laugh till their stomachs hurt. She wasn't just a beautiful memory. She was coming home. But for Amara, the future wasn't as clear. She'd seen this before: foreign students who fell in love with the idea of her, only to leave. Thomas promised he wasn't like that. He said he'd introduce her to his parents. He said he could take her back with him. He meant every word, even though he hadn't told them yet. Not even a hint. When he finally made the call to his mother, he did it with the kind of hesitant courage that made his voice sound both calm and uncertain. He waited until late evening, hoping the quiet of the day would make the conversation easier, but all it did was amplify the silence on the other end. She picked up on the 3rd ring, cheerful as always, asking him about the food, the people, whether he was staying hydrated, whether the mosquitoes were bad. He answered each question patiently, knowing that once he brought it up, the tone would shift. And then he said it, carefully but directly. He told her about Amara. He told her she was brilliant, that she had helped him see parts of himself he never noticed. He told her that he was falling in love. There was a pause. A pause long enough to let the hope in his chest begin to shrink. His mother didn't say anything at first, and then she asked, "Where is she from?" Not in a curious way, but in a measuring way, like she was mentally calculating what that meant. He said Ghana, and her response was a clipped "oh." Another pause. Then came the slow stream of questions dressed in concern. Was she religious? What did her parents do? Did she want to move to America? Was she serious about him, or was this just a romantic moment for her? 2 questions that had nothing to do with who Amara was and everything to do with what she wasn't. Thomas had never noticed it before, how easily love could be categorized, analyzed, turned into something academic and strategic. His mother never raised her voice, never said anything overtly disrespectful. But there was something in her tone, a kind of emotional caution, like he was telling her he planned to drop out of school rather than open his heart. His father joined the call briefly, offered a polite "that's interesting," and asked vague questions about Amara's future plans. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he said, "Well, you're young. There's plenty of time to figure things out." The implication stung. Figure things out, as if this wasn't real. As if love only mattered once it had been filed through a checklist. When the call ended, Thomas sat on his bed for a long time, the screen dark in his hand. He thought about how many times he'd asked his parents for advice, how often he had sought their approval without even realizing it. And now, in the one moment he hoped they would just be happy for him, they couldn't even pretend. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was just tired. Tired of decoding their words. Tired of pretending the discomfort he heard in their voices was something else. This wasn't about her character or their concern for his future. It was about control, about fear, about maintaining a version of their family that looked like them and sounded like them and married like them. Thomas had always believed love would be enough. That if he felt it strongly, it would carry him through anything. But now he was beginning to understand that the hardest part of love wasn't falling into it. It was defending it in the quiet moments when no one else seemed to believe it was real. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. He just knew that the person who had been the center of his days for months, the person who made him laugh in the rain, who challenged him, who made his life feel less like a path and more like a story, was now someone he had to protect, not from strangers, but from the people who raised him. The next morning, he noticed it in her eyes. Not a question. Not even a suspicion. Just a calm resignation that something was shifting. Amara had grown up reading between the lines. She didn't need him to say anything to know the tone of the air had changed. He kissed her forehead like he always did and asked what she wanted for breakfast, trying to keep things normal, pretending that last night's phone call hadn't created a divide between his heart and his heritage. She smiled gently and said, "Surprise me." But when he turned away, her face fell, just for a moment. As the days passed, Thomas started slipping. Not in love, but in presence. He answered fewer of her questions about the future. He hesitated before mentioning his parents. He nodded along when she talked about her ambitions but avoided mentioning how those dreams would fit into his own life back home. Amara didn't accuse him. She didn't demand clarity. That wasn't her style. She watched him quietly, listened for the unsaid things, and began making peace with the silence. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than anger. And sometimes people don't leave because of something cruel. They leave because of something missing. One night, after dinner, they sat on the rooftop of her building. The city lights flickered like stars beneath them, the air humid but kind. It was their favorite place. But tonight it felt unfamiliar. She sat with her legs tucked under her, staring out at the skyline, and asked, "Would you still love me if no one approved of us?" It wasn't a dramatic question. It was practical. Real. A test without malice. He looked at her, heart aching, and said, "Of course I would." But it came out too fast. Too rehearsed. Too safe. Amara looked away and didn't respond. Thomas felt helpless. He didn't know how to bridge this new silence. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't being honest either. He was still holding out hope that if he just gave it time, if he introduced her slowly, his parents would come around. That love could be reasoned with, if only people would just sit down and listen. But love isn't a pitch. And Amara wasn't an idea to be sold. The truth was, he had never had to fight for anything like this before. He'd always lived in lanes where success was rewarded, where behavior was praised, where following the rules meant people approved of you. But this was different. This required not just belief but defiance. Not just love but loyalty. And that terrified him. Amara had seen this before. Not with him, but with others. Westerners who came in with open hearts and closed minds. Who loved the rhythm of her words but not the history behind them. Who saw her beauty but filtered it through exotic lenses. Who meant well but chose comfort over courage when it mattered. She had hoped Thomas would be different. And maybe he still was. But hope isn't enough when history is pressing down on your shoulders. They didn't break up that night. There were no tears. Just a long quiet stare between two people who loved each other but didn't know if they were standing on the same side of the storm. And in that moment, Thomas realized something deeply painful, that sometimes love isn't blocked by anger or betrayal, but by the fear of not being enough to rewrite the beliefs of the people who raised you. As the days wore on, the distance between Thomas and Amara grew in ways that neither of them could explain. She began spending more time with her friends, going to the local markets, catching up with her family in ways that felt less like she was living her life and more like she was retreating into a world she knew, a world where he wasn't the center. Thomas didn't understand what was happening at first. He thought maybe it was just a phase, maybe she was struggling with the thought of their future. He had even convinced himself that if he just gave her space, if he didn't push her into any decisions about their relationship, things would eventually smooth over. But the truth was, Amara wasn't just pulling away from him. She was trying to protect herself. She had always known how quickly things could change when the weight of someone else's expectations entered the picture. And in that moment, she was doing the one thing she knew how to do, keeping her distance to preserve her dignity. She wasn't angry with Thomas. She wasn't even hurt by him. She was simply tired of feeling like an outsider in her own love story. One evening, when he called her to meet up, she hesitated. The hesitation wasn't just about location or timing. It was the uncertainty that had taken root between them. When they finally sat down together in a quiet cafe, the air between them felt thick. She spoke first, her words slow and deliberate. "Thomas, do you love me the way you say you do?" she asked it not as a challenge but as a simple question, seeking clarity. He nodded quickly, too quickly, as if answering would ease the tension. But she didn't seem convinced. There was something in her eyes, a sort of sadness, not because of anything specific he had done, but because she knew what was at stake. She leaned forward, her voice softer now. "If you love me, why don't you stand up for us? Why are you letting them decide our future?" Her words hit him like a cold wave. It wasn't the accusation he was expecting. It wasn't the harsh judgment or the disappointment he had braced himself for. It was the quiet desperation for him to act. For him to choose them. "You're waiting for approval," she continued. "But love doesn't wait for permission. It just is." Thomas sat back, unable to answer immediately. His mind was racing, his heart heavy. In that moment, he realized how much he had allowed the weight of his parents' approval to shape his decisions. He wasn't just seeking their approval for her. He was seeking their approval for himself, for his choices, for his future. And he had convinced himself that it was a matter of time before they saw things his way. But Amara was right. He was waiting. And love couldn't be put on pause for approval. But what was he supposed to do? How could he stand up to his parents, the ones who had given him everything, who had nurtured him and raised him with the values they believed in? The thought of cutting that tether, of severing the bond that had defined his life for so long, terrified him. Amara was asking him to choose between her and them, and he wasn't sure he was ready to make that choice. They spent the rest of the evening in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. But the conversation, the question, lingered in Thomas's mind long after he returned to his apartment. It was the first time that the reality of their situation felt undeniable. This wasn't just a matter of love. This was about the courage to live authentically, to take a stand for the person you loved, no matter the consequences. The next few days were filled with an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about what Amara had said, and her words gnawed at him relentlessly. He walked through the streets of Accra, his mind clouded, his steps slow, as though he were walking through a fog. Everywhere he looked, couples moved past him, laughing, holding hands, sharing moments that seemed simple but felt out of reach. He felt disconnected, as if he were watching a movie of his own life and had lost the ability to interact with the characters. Amara, on the other hand, seemed almost lighter. She spent time with her friends, focused on her work, and even smiled more often. She didn't avoid him, but she also didn't seem desperate for his attention. She had made her peace with the distance, and it seemed to be a choice that came more easily to her than it did to him. In the beginning, Thomas had admired her strength, her ability to carry herself with such self-assurance. But now, that same strength felt like a barrier. It felt like she was moving on without him. He tried calling her a few times, but she was busy with work or social commitments. When they did meet, it was brief and polite, with an air of formality that wasn't there before. The intimacy they once shared felt like a distant memory. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to tell her that he was scared, that he didn't know how to handle the situation, that his fear of losing her was slowly drowning him. One afternoon, Thomas found himself at a cafe near her apartment, waiting for her to arrive. He had been sitting there for an hour, his coffee growing cold, his thoughts scattered. And then she walked in, dressed in simple clothes but with a presence that made everything around her fade. She looked at him and smiled briefly, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made his heart race. It was distant, reserved. She sat down across from him, and for a moment, they didn't speak. The silence between them was thick, filled with everything that had gone unsaid. Finally, she broke it. "I can't wait forever, Thomas," she said quietly. "And I won't make you choose me over them. But I need you to choose yourself. I need you to decide what kind of life you want to live." The words hit him harder than anything else she had ever said. Amara wasn't demanding. She wasn't pleading. She was simply stating the truth. He had been waiting for things to get easier, for his parents to come around, for a sign that this was the right path. But there were no signs, no guarantees. He had to decide, and that decision had to come from within him, not from anyone else. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but the words were tangled in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain to her that he was still a son before he was a man? How could he make her understand that he was stuck between the life he had known and the life he was trying to build? The tension was unbearable, but it was also necessary. Because in that moment, he realized that love wasn't just about holding on to what you wanted. It was about the courage to let go of what you knew, and to stand up for the future you were willing to create, no matter how uncertain it might be. That evening, Thomas didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above him, each rotation a reminder of the time passing, of the choice he hadn't yet made. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of a car passing by outside. His phone buzzed once, then stopped. He didn't bother to check. He knew it wouldn't be her. Not tonight. He thought about the last time his mother had held his hand. He must have been 11 or 12. They were walking through the park after his football practice, and she bought him ice cream, the way she always did when he had a good day. He thought about how she had looked at him back then, proud, loving, safe. And now, it felt like all that warmth had frozen over the moment he told her about Amara. It wasn't just disapproval. It was the sharp sting of disappointment. It was the silence that followed every call, the way his father barely said a word before handing the phone back. It was the way their love felt conditional for the first time in his life. What hurt even more was that Amara never asked for any of this. She didn't ask to be put on a pedestal, she didn't ask to be anyone's rebellion. She just wanted to be loved honestly. Thomas realized that the choice he had been avoiding wasn't just about who to marry. It was about identity. About whether he was going to live a life dictated by inherited values or one he shaped with his own 2 hands. By morning, he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were heavy, but his thoughts were sharper than they had been in weeks. He went for a walk just as the sun was coming up. The streets were quiet, the air cool, the scent of morning fires and fried dough mixing with the city's breath. He passed a group of schoolchildren laughing, an old man sweeping the front of his shop, a mother braiding her daughter's hair on the porch. Life was moving around him, ordinary and uninterrupted. And in that walk, he made a decision, not a dramatic, movie-style decision, but a quiet one, the kind that settles into your bones. He needed to speak to his parents, not to ask for permission, not to beg, but to tell them. Tell them what he had decided. Tell them who he had become. Whether or not they understood was not in his control. But silence had become a burden he could no longer carry. Later that afternoon, he scheduled a video call with them. He stared at the screen, heart pounding, waiting for their faces to appear. When they did, his mother smiled cautiously. His father remained neutral. There were no pleasantries. He didn't lead into it. He simply said, "I'm in love with her, and I'm not walking away from it. I know this isn't what you hoped for, but I won't apologize for who she is. She's kind, she's brave, and she makes me want to be better. I understand if you're disappointed, but I won't be ashamed of my heart." There was a long silence. His mother's face barely changed. His father cleared his throat but said nothing. And then his mother responded, not with anger but with pain. "You're our son," she said slowly. "But you've changed. This isn't the life we imagined for you." Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. "Maybe I have changed," he said, "but maybe that's okay." The call ended without resolution. But for the first time, Thomas felt like he had taken ownership of his own life. He didn't know what would come next, but he had finally stopped waiting for someone else to decide it for him. After the call, Thomas walked for hours. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel strong. If anything, he felt small. Vulnerable. He had expected that by speaking his truth, something inside him would click into place. But instead, he was met with a kind of emptiness that came from realizing you might never get back what you once had. The following day, he went to see Amara. She opened the door, surprised to see him without warning. Her eyes scanned his face and must have seen something different, something she hadn't seen in weeks. She stepped aside without saying a word, letting him in. He sat on her couch, rubbing his palms against his jeans, unsure of how to start. "I told them," he said finally. "Everything." She didn't react right away. She sat across from him, hands folded, watching him carefully, and she asked. He shook his head. They didn't take it well. But I didn't expect them to. I just needed them to hear it. I needed to say it. There was a pause. Then she exhaled, a long, quiet breath. What now? She asked. He looked up at her. Now, we live. Not for them. For us. Amara stood up and walked to the window. She stared out at the street, her posture still, her thoughts clearly moving fast. After a while, she spoke. You know, I wanted to believe this was possible. I wanted to believe we could just fall in love and everything else would figure itself out. But I've seen too many people break under pressure, Thomas. I've seen families destroy love, not because the love wasn't real, but because people were too afraid to protect it. He walked over to her, gently touching her hand. I'm not afraid anymore, he said. I've lost something already. And maybe I'll lose more. But I'd rather lose what's behind me than lose you for a long time. She didn't say anything. Then she looked at him, not with doubt, not with sadness, but with something else. Maybe hope. Maybe the beginning of healing. Okay, she said softly. Then let's try. But not halfway. If we do this, we do it fully. They didn't kiss, didn't make any promises. They just stood there, holding hands, both aware of how fragile and strong love could be at the same time. They knew this wasn't the end of their problems. There would still be judgment, still be fear, still be long nights wondering if they had made the right choice. But there would also be mornings like this one, where love didn't have to fight to exist, and for now, that was enough. A few weeks passed, and life seemed to find its rhythm again, even if the air around Thomas felt different. He and Amara were still together, still talking about the future, but they didn't rush anything. They met in quieter places now, away from stares that lingered too long or whispers that didn't care to be quiet. Every day felt like a tightrope balancing joy with worry, peace with caution. But despite it all, their connection remained, not because everything was perfect, but because they had both chosen to stay. One evening, Amara invited him to her uncle's farm on the outskirts of town. It was a place filled with laughter, the smell of grilled meat, distant drumbeats, and voices rising in casual, unfiltered conversation. It wasn't grand or elegant. It didn't try to impress. It just felt human. Real. Her family had been cautious with Thomas at first, skeptical, maybe even protective. But over time, they began to see him not as a stranger, but as someone trying, someone present. He wasn't loud or trying to prove anything. He was just there. Respectfully. That night, under the stars, Amara's uncle pulled Thomas aside. The man was broad-shouldered, firm-eyed, with the kind of presence that commanded silence without raising his voice. He didn't talk in circles. Do you love her? He asked, straight, no emotion on his face. Thomas answered just as plainly. Yes, sir. I do. The uncle didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't challenge. He just held that stare a moment longer and said, then you better be ready. Love's not a ticket out. It's a door in. And you don't walk through it without bringing your past with you. That sentence stayed with Thomas the rest of the night. He knew what it meant. Love didn't erase the world they came from. It didn't fix old wounds or quiet every opinion. It just demanded honesty, commitment, and the courage to face what came next. He and Amara weren't just a couple anymore. They were becoming a story. One that others would judge, question, admire, or even envy. But what mattered most was how they told it together. Later that week, Thomas received an email from his university advisor. Graduation was approaching. His thesis on African innovation and economic identity had been well received, but they needed a formal submission date. That should have been good news. But it only added pressure. It reminded him that his time in Africa was nearing an end. The thought of leaving made his chest tighten. He hadn't talked to Amara about it yet, not directly. Every time he tried to bring it up, the words caught in his throat. That night, lying beside her, he finally whispered, "What happens when I leave?" She didn't respond right away. She traced circles on his palm, her eyes distant. I've been asking myself the same thing, she finally said. But we can't plan a future by fearing it. He turned to her. I want you in my future. Not just here. Anywhere. She looked at him and smiled, but there was sadness behind it. Then we have to fight for it. Because it's not going to be easy. It wasn't just the logistics, visas, jobs, families. It was the emotional cost. The silent doubts. The unspoken fears. The people who'd never understand. The life they'd be building on two foundations from two different worlds. And still, despite all of that, he knew he didn't want anyone else. As graduation approached, everything became more urgent. Papers had to be filed, documents submitted, and farewells quietly prepared. Thomas wasn't sleeping much. His days were filled with research, presentations, and long phone calls to embassies and advisors. But his nights belonged to Amara, each one more precious than the last. They spoke less about the future and more about the present, what they saw, what they felt, what they feared. It was easier to live in the moment than plan for the unknown. One night, Amara received a job offer from a local NGO that focused on girls' education and community development. It was a huge opportunity, her first full-time position since finishing university. She was excited, but she hesitated to celebrate. It's not abroad, she said quietly. It's here. Which means I'm staying. Thomas smiled, though his heart ached. That's a good thing, he said. It means you're doing what you love. You should take it. But inside, he wondered if it was the first sign that their paths might start to separate. A week later, Thomas received an offer to an internship with a renowned think tank in New York. It was a competitive position, one that only a few students in his program had managed to secure. His advisor congratulated him. His classmates envied him. His parents, in their brief reply, wrote, "This is what we always hoped you'd become." But for Thomas, the news felt bittersweet. Because it meant a ticking clock had just been set in motion. That weekend, he and Amara took a trip to the Costa, quiet getaway before the next chapter began. They walked barefoot on the shore, waves licking their ankles, the sun melting into the ocean. They didn't talk much, but everything that needed to be said lived in the silences between them. That night, over a small fire, Thomas turned to her. I think we should try long distance, he said. Not because it's easy. But because this is real. And I don't want to pretend it's not just because of geography. Amara nodded slowly. I don't want to let this go either. But if we do this, we have to be honest about everything. The time zones, the waiting, the loneliness. All of it. He reached for her hand. I'd rather go through all of that than go through life wondering what we could have been. She smiled, tears in her eyes. Okay. Then let's try it. They didn't make promises they couldn't keep. They didn't vow forever or sketch out wedding plans. They just agreed to try. To show up. To believe that love, when chosen every day, had the strength to survive even the strongest winds. As the fire crackled beside them, and the stars stitched patterns across the sky, they held onto each other, not out of desperation, but out of hope. A quiet, brave kind of hope. Thomas returned to the capital a different man. The coast had given him and Amara a temporary sanctuary, but now reality was staring at him again with cold, unblinking eyes. His return flight to the U.S. was only a few weeks away. His internship paperwork was finalized. A furnished apartment near the institute had already been arranged by the program. Every detail of his future was in motion, except the one that mattered most: how to carry love across borders, cultures, and uncertainty. His friends were beginning to celebrate their own transitions, some traveling home, others applying for local roles. Conversations shifted toward next steps, future cities, salaries, and visas. But Thomas struggled to feel joy. Every success came with a shadow, every moment of excitement with a pang of guilt. He was leaving Amara behind. And though they had agreed to try long distance, the weight of what that truly meant grew heavier with each sunrise. He had one last formal dinner to attend, hosted by the university to honor graduating students. Faculty members, foreign dignitaries, and students filled the hall with small talk, laughter, and clinking glasses. He wore a simple suit, but it felt like armor. Everything looked polished, but he felt unfinished. His professor approached him with a glass of wine and a firm handshake. "You should be proud," he said. "You've made a mark here." Thomas nodded, but he didn't feel marked. He felt split. Later that night, he stepped outside to call Amara. Her voice came through soft and steady. "How was it?" she asked. "Too formal," he replied. "Felt like I was at someone else's party." She laughed gently, then fell silent. "I know this is hard," she said. "I've been trying to stay strong, but I cry sometimes when I think about you not being here." He closed his eyes. "I know. Me too." And for the first time, he allowed himself to cry, not from sadness alone, but from the aching truth that love often demands more from us than comfort. A few days later, he invited her to a quiet dinner. Nothing extravagant, just a local spot they had once stumbled into on their second date. They sat across from each other, both quieter than usual. They talked about her job, his internship, the food, the music in the background, everything except the one thing looming over their heads. Then finally, Amara broke the silence. "What happens when you go back and your parents find out about me?" He looked down, folding his napkin slowly. "They already know." She blinked. And he took a breath. "My mother said she couldn't support it. She called it a phase. My father didn't say much. Just told me not to embarrass the family." Her eyes dropped. "So nothing's changed?" He shook his head. "No. But I have. I can't unlove you to make them more comfortable." She looked at him, holding back tears. "Then they'll blame me. Think I corrupted you. Took you away." He reached across the table, gently took her hand. "Let them think whatever they want. What matters is what we know." And in that moment, they knew something deeper than words. They were not each other's distraction. They were each other's decision. The final days moved in slow motion. Every walk down the familiar streets, every shared meal, every look across a crowded room, Thomas felt like he was watching it all from outside his own life. He tried to memorize the way Amara tilted her head when she listened, the way she laughed with her whole body, the way her eyes met his without flinching. He didn't want to take pictures. He wanted to carry her in memory, in muscle, in rhythm. They spent one last evening at her family's house. Her uncle was quiet that night, but before Thomas left, he pulled him aside once more. "The world will never be as simple as you want it to be," he said. "But if you love my niece, don't come back here with excuses. Come back with answers." Thomas nodded. He didn't know what answers he would have, but he knew he'd look for them. At the airport, everything felt surreal. Amara wore a yellow scarf, her eyes tired but proud. They didn't cry loudly, didn't make a scene. They held each other like it was their last breath, then let go. "Write to me," she whispered. "Every week." He smiled. Every day. The flight was long, but Thomas didn't sleep. Back in the States, everything felt muted. The streets, the people, even the air. His parents picked him up at the airport, his father driving, his mother asking questions that felt rehearsed. He answered politely but kept his heart on lockdown. That night, as he unpacked, he saw Amara's bracelet tucked in a side pocket. He wore it quietly, beneath his sleeve, like a secret promise. Over the next few weeks, he adjusted to the fast pace of New York. Meetings, deadlines, apartment noise. But he kept his word: texts, emails, late-night calls with Amara. She'd send him photos from work, updates about the girls she mentored, snapshots of sunsets that reminded her of him. They talked about visiting each other. They talked about what kind of life they wanted, about what scared them, what grounded them. Then, one Sunday morning, Thomas visited his parents. It started as small talk, then slipped into silence. His mother finally said, "I hope you're back to yourself now." Thomas looked at her. "I never left myself. You just never bothered to see who I really was." His father shifted uncomfortably. "You don't understand what this could mean for your career, your life." Thomas stood. "What it means is that I've finally found someone who makes me feel whole. And I won't give that up just to protect your expectations." He left before they could argue more. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt raw. But for the first time in his life, he felt free. The days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Summer bled into fall, and still Thomas and Amara stayed connected, their relationship surviving through daily voice notes, blurry video calls, and the kind of emotional honesty that didn't leave room for pretenses. It was harder than either of them imagined. There were nights Thomas would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how much distance love could really take before it began to thin out, before it started to fray. His internship was demanding. The kind that impressed people at dinner parties but left little room for personal life. He was often the last to leave the office, the first to wake up. Colleagues admired his work ethic, but nobody knew he was running, trying to outrun the doubt, the ache, the small voice that whispered he might lose her to time or circumstance. He'd see couples on the subway holding hands and feel both hope and longing in the same breath. Amara was struggling too. Her community work was growing, but so was the pressure. Some days she sounded tired, emotionally depleted. A few donors had pulled out, and she was left stretching every penny to keep her programs alive. She never asked Thomas for anything, but he knew the weight was heavy. He wired her some money once, discreetly, but she returned it. "I don't want our love to be measured in what we can give each other financially," she said. "I want it to be about what we can carry emotionally." They started planning. Not just in the abstract, but with dates and timelines. Amara applied for a visitor's visa. Thomas started checking short-term job opportunities in Ghana, even if it meant sacrificing pay or prestige. For the first time, they allowed themselves to dream out loud, maybe a small apartment in Accra, maybe teaching, maybe building something together. They talked about marriage too, not as a fairy tale but as a promise grounded in mutual struggle and deep understanding. But just as things started to gain shape, a new obstacle appeared: Thomas's father. Not through confrontation this time, but through silence. A silence that spread like fog, unspoken disapproval filling every room Thomas entered. His mother had become polite but distant. He'd overhear her on the phone talking about phases and embarrassments and what the neighbors might say. They never mentioned Amara by name. It was as if she had become a concept rather than a person. An inconvenience point: one night, after dinner, his father sat him down and handed him a letter. It was from a private contact at the firm. A job offer: international, prestigious, extremely competitive. "This is your future," his father said. "This is how you move forward." Thomas read it, his hands cold. It was everything he had ever been taught to want. Everything his parents had sacrificed for. But it came with an unsaid clause: "Leave Amara behind. Focus. Don't complicate your life with a relationship that makes things messy." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he called Amara. He told her about the offer. About what it meant. About how it felt like his future had arrived, but in the wrong room. She didn't react angrily. She just listened. Then she said something that stayed with him for days. "If love asks you to shrink yourself to fit someone else's dream, is it still love? And if success means erasing who we are, what exactly are we winning?" The next morning, Thomas stood by the window, watching the city wake up. His phone buzzed: a message from his father, just one line: "Don't throw your life away." He looked out at the skyline. At all the glass and steel and movement. Then he looked down at his phone and typed, slowly, steadily. "I'm not throwing my life away. I'm choosing it." The decision was made. Thomas declined the job offer. He sent a polite thank you note, wished them all the best, and closed the email without regret. There was a strange peace in knowing he had chosen on his own terms, even if those terms didn't make sense to anyone else. He told his parents over breakfast. His father didn't speak. His mother looked like she'd been slapped. But Thomas didn't explain himself. Not out of disrespect, but because explanations no longer seemed necessary. He bought a one-way ticket back to Ghana. Not because he had everything figured out, but because he finally knew what mattered enough to take the risk for. The moment he landed, he called Amara. She met him outside the airport, standing near the same cafe where they had once shared tea and a mango tart. When she saw him, she didn't smile immediately. She just stood there, waiting to believe it was real. Then, slowly, she walked to him, and they embraced, not like two people starting over, but like two people who had already survived the storm. They rented a small flat near the coast. Nothing fancy. A cracked ceiling, a temperamental shower, and a neighbor who played loud music every Sunday. But it was theirs. Thomas took on a teaching assistant role at a local university. Amara continued her community work, now with Thomas helping part-time. They didn't talk about proving anyone wrong. They talked about building something real. Their wedding wasn't grand. Just a handful of friends, some family, and a borrowed dress. Amara's uncle gave the only speech. Love, he said, isn't about grand gestures. It's about standing still in a world that keeps trying to pull you away from each other. And refusing to move. News traveled back home. Some relatives called to offer quiet congratulations. Others remained silent. His mother sent a short message, "I hope you're happy." He didn't reply. Not because he was angry, but because he finally understood that not everyone has the capacity to see love for what it is when it doesn't look the way they expect. Years passed. They had a child. A daughter, with Amara's eyes and Thomas's stubborn smile.